In the rain-soaked blur of a forgotten street, a young janitor dropped his worn lunchbox to cradle a bleeding stranger while the city hurried past, never knowing that single act of kindness would one day rewrite his entire destiny. Hello family, if you're ready for the full story, make sure you hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Tomorrow, I've got another story that will blow your mind, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Now let's dive in. The night smelled of bleach and loneliness. Under the buzzing fluorescent lights of Jefferson High School, Daniel Hayes leaned on his mop handle, his shoulders aching from 12 straight hours of scrubbing hallways and classrooms. His janitor's uniform clung damply to his back, the gray fabric worn thin at the elbows. On his cart sat a faded lunchbox plastered with his daughter's stickers, unicorns, rainbows, and one badly peeled glitter star. That box was more than just for food, it was a reminder. Every sandwich he packed before work, every cookie slipped in by small eager hands, it tethered him to the reason he kept going. "Daddy, don't forget the smiley face this time," his little girl Lily had said that morning, shoving a napkin into his hand with a crayon smiley already drawn on it. He hadn't forgotten. The napkin lay folded neatly inside the box. He'd eat his cold sandwich tonight with her smiley looking up at him, as if she were keeping him company while he pushed through another shift. Daniel was only 28, but fatigue aged him. Life had carved lines at the corners of his eyes, lines not from laughter but from too many nights awake wondering how rent would get paid, or what kind of future he could offer a little girl who deserved the world. He whistled sometimes to keep his spirits up, but the echoes of his mop strokes across the empty hallway always reminded him how quiet his life had become. Still, he wore his sacrifices like armor. Each sweep of the mop was a promise. Lily would never feel the abandonment he once knew. Across town, in a penthouse suite that looked down on the same city Daniel was cleaning, Edward Langford stared at his reflection in a wall of glass. 62 years old, he was a man who had conquered industries, outbid competitors, and carved his empire from ruthless ambition. His name meant power in boardrooms. His signature could shift markets. But tonight, staring past his reflection into the scattered city lights, Edward felt a gnawing hollowness. His designer suit hung loose despite its perfect tailoring. Wealth had not protected him from age's erosion. On his dining table, an untouched meal cooled under the glow of a chandelier worth more than most houses. Lobster truffle, a bottle of wine breathing beside crystal glasses, meant for two, but there was no second plate. Edward's estranged children hadn't returned his calls in months. His wife had long ago stopped sharing dinners like this, retreating into her own guarded world. The silence of the penthouse was unbearable, amplified by the city's distant hum below. When his chest tightened suddenly, he pressed a hand against it, frowning. "Not tonight," he thought. "I have meetings tomorrow. Stock reports. Deadlines. The empire needs me." But the empire wouldn't hold him if he fell. And a truth Edward had never wanted to face whispered cruelly. Money could buy silence, servants, even fear, but it could not buy someone to rush to your side when you collapsed. Hours later, Daniel left the school with his lunchbox under one arm. The night air was damp, carrying the promise of rain. Street lamps buzzed like tired bees, their orange glow pooling onto slick sidewalks. His boots scuffed against cracked pavement as he made his way to the bus stop at 12th and Main. He hated these late shifts, not because of the work, but because Lily would already be asleep by the time he got home. He often crept into her tiny bedroom, kissed her forehead, and whispered promises she couldn't hear. "One day it'll be easier, sweetheart. One day." The bus stop was nearly deserted. A couple argued in hushed tones on the far bench, their shadows stretching long and sharp under the flickering light. An older man in a trench coat leaned against the metal pole, checking his watch impatiently. No one met anyone else's eyes. The city at midnight had a way of making people invisible to each other. Daniel set down his lunchbox and sat, his hands still smelling faintly of lemon disinfectant. He tilted his head back and exhaled, watching a bead of rain slip from the bus shelter roof to the pavement. That's when he noticed the commotion further down the block. A man in a dark coat stumbled from the curb, clutching his chest. He fell against a lamppost, then crumpled to the ground, his hand streaked with blood. The couple stopped arguing for half a second, glanced his way, then went back to their fight. The man in the trench coat adjusted his hat and turned away. People kept walking, eyes flicking toward the fallen figure before sliding back to their phones, their destinations, their own worlds. Daniel blinked. Is no one going to help him? He stood. His heart pounded, not from fear but from instinct. In that split second, the exhaustion of his day melted into urgency. Without thinking, he grabbed his lunchbox and hurried toward the fallen man, his boots splashing through shallow puddles. The stranger was older, with silver hair matted to his forehead, his expensive coat stained dark with blood. His lips were pale, his breathing ragged. And though Daniel didn't recognize him yet, this was Edward Langford, the billionaire whose name filled financial magazines but meant nothing on this lonely, wet street. Kneeling beside him, Daniel said, breathless but steady, "Sir? Hey, stay with me, okay? You're not alone." Edward's eyelids fluttered. His gaze, dim but searching, fixed on the janitor's tired young face, the only one who had stopped. And in that unspoken moment, destiny began to shift. If you were at that bus stop, would you have stopped to help, or kept walking like the others? Comment below. Do you think one small act of kindness can really change a life? Rain had begun to fall in earnest, sharp droplets slanting sideways in the chill wind. Streetlight halos blurred in the downpour, painting the sidewalk with trembling gold. Daniel's knees hit the wet pavement as he crouched beside the stranger, his janitor's uniform instantly soaking through. "Sir? Can you hear me?" Daniel asked, fumbling for a pulse at the man's neck. His fingers brushed clammy skin, his heart racing faster than the pulse beneath his touch. The man, Edward, let out a shallow groan. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. Rain streaked across his face, mixing with the blood staining his shirt front. "Help!" Edward's voice was barely more than a whisper, a hoarse plea swallowed by the hiss of rainfall. Daniel's throat tightened. He glanced up at the bus stop. The couple still argued, too wrapped in their own storm to notice. The man in the trench coat had already crossed the street, quickening his pace. A taxi slowed as if curious, then sped away. Nobody else was coming. "It's okay," Daniel said firmly, leaning closer. "I've got you. Just hold on." He set his lunchbox aside and tore off his work jacket, pressing it hard against the wound on Edward's chest. Warm blood soaked through the fabric instantly, spreading like fire against his palms. The iron tang of it filled his nose. He pressed harder, his own breath coming in ragged bursts. Edward grimaced, a sound of pain escaping him, but he didn't push Daniel away. His trembling hand caught Daniel's wrist weakly. Why stop?" he muttered, his eyes searching. Daniel blinked through rain dripping down his lashes. "Because you need help. Because nobody deserves to be left like this." Edward's lips twitched as if forming a bitter laugh, but it caught in his throat. His hand slipped from Daniel's wrist, his strength failing. "Stay with me," Daniel urged, panic sharpening his voice. He looked around frantically, then shouted toward the bus stop, "Somebody call 911." No one moved. The couple kept their backs turned. The only response was the hiss of rain and the distant blare of a car horn. Anger surged hot in Daniel's chest. "Fine. I'll do it myself." With one hand keeping pressure on the wound, he dug his phone out of his pocket, fumbling to dial. The screen slipped under his wet fingers, but finally the line rang. 911, what's your emergency? There's a man, he's hurt, he's bleeding bad, corner of 12th and Main. Daniel's voice shook but held firm. Send an ambulance, now. The operator's calm questions anchored him as he rattled off details. He didn't dare loosen his grip on Edward's wound, even as his muscles burned with effort. "Help's coming," Daniel whispered, leaning close again. "Don't you dare give up on me, okay? What's your name?" Edward's eyelids fluttered. His lips parted. "Edward." "All right, Edward. I'm Daniel. And I swear to you, you're not dying on this street tonight." Edward's gaze locked onto his, faint but steady. For a fleeting second, something flickered there, not just fear but astonishment. Astonishment that anyone, cared enough to stay. Minutes stretched like hours. Daniel knelt in the rain, his body numb, his thoughts screaming. He thought of Lily asleep in her little bed, of how she would one day ask why his hands bore scars and calluses. Maybe tonight would be the story behind one of them. Edward coughed, blood flecking his lips. Daniel adjusted his jacket against the wound, murmuring, "Easy, easy. Just breathe with me. In, out. Yeah, like that." His voice softened, the way he spoke to Lily after nightmares. Edward's brows knit, confusion in his expression. "You sound like," he trailed off, swallowing hard. "A father." Daniel's throat tightened, but he nodded. "Yeah. A father who needs to make sure his daughter sees him come home. And you," his voice firmed, "you're gonna see tomorrow too." For the first time in years, Edward let someone's words anchor him. Finally, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder. Blue and red lights bled through the curtain of rain. Relief nearly buckled Daniel's knees. "Hear that?" he said urgently. "They're almost here. Hold on for me just a little longer." Edward's lips quivered as though he wanted to speak. Daniel leaned closer. Why did you stop?" Edward's voice cracked. Nobody ever stops." Daniel's chest ached at the rawness of the words. He swallowed hard. "Because I know what it feels like to be invisible. And I'm not about to let you disappear in front of me." Edward stared at him, breath ragged, rainwater glistening on his lashes. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, fragile but real. The ambulance screeched to a halt, medics rushing with a stretcher and medical bags. "Step back, sir, we've got him," one barked, but Daniel didn't move until a medic physically relieved his hands of the makeshift compress. His jacket, soaked in blood, was tossed aside. His hands trembled violently, stained crimson. As they lifted Edward onto the stretcher, his gaze drifted back to Daniel. His lips moved weakly, forming words only Daniel caught. "Thank you." Daniel nodded once, throat too tight to reply. The medics bundled Edward into the ambulance, doors slamming shut. Sirens roared as the vehicle pulled away, lights carving through the stormy night. And just like that, the street was empty again, except for Daniel, kneeling in the rain with blood on his hands, his lunchbox sitting silently on the curb. He exhaled shakily, staring at his trembling fingers. He had no idea who that man really was. No idea that tonight's choice would unravel into something far greater than he could imagine. But somewhere deep in his gut, he knew, nothing about his life would be the same after this. Would you have had the courage to stop in Daniel's place, or the humility to accept help in Edward's? Comment below, which is harder, giving help or receiving it? The rain had stopped by morning, but the city still carried the damp chill of the night before. Streets gleamed with puddles that mirrored a dull gray sky. Daniel sat at the tiny kitchen table in his apartment, the smell of cheap coffee filling the air. His hands, scrubbed raw, still bore faint stains of blood that soap couldn't wash away completely. He flexed his fingers unconsciously, remembering the warmth of it, the weight of a stranger's life pressing beneath his palms. "Daddy." Lily's small voice pulled him from his thoughts. She padded into the kitchen in her fuzzy unicorn pajamas, her hair a golden mess from sleep. She rubbed her eyes and climbed into his lap, resting her head against his chest. "You're home late again," she mumbled. "Yes, sweet pea," Daniel said softly, kissing the crown of her head. "Long night. What happened?" He hesitated. How could he explain the sight of a man bleeding on the street, the terror of holding his life in your hands, to a 6-year-old? He forced a smile. "Just helped somebody who needed it." "Like a superhero?" Daniel chuckled, though his chest tightened. "Not quite. Just a guy who was in the wrong place at the wrong time." Lily grinned, unconvinced. "You are a superhero." She tugged at his shirt collar. "Even if your cape looks like a mop." Her giggle broke through his heaviness, and for a moment he let himself laugh with her. But when she scampered off to fetch her toys, his smile faded. He stared into his coffee, thinking of the man's pale face, the whispered thank you. Who was he? And had he made it through the night? Daniel shook the thought away. It wasn't his business anymore. He had bills to pay, shifts to cover, lunches to pack. Whatever happened to that stranger belonged to someone else's story. His job was to keep his little girl safe, not chase mysteries. Across the city, Edward Langford woke in a private hospital suite. The steady beep of machines surrounded him, along with the sterile smell of antiseptic. His chest throbbed where the wound had been treated. He blinked against the morning light streaming through the tall windows. A nurse adjusted his fore and offered a polite smile. "You're lucky, Mr. Langford." Another few minutes without help, and she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Edward turned his head away, his jaw tightening. He hated the word lucky. It implied something out of his control, and Edward Langford had built his entire life on control. "Who brought me in?" he asked, his voice rough. The nurse hesitated. "A young man. Said his name was Daniel. A janitor, I think. He stayed until we took over." Edward's brow furrowed. A janitor. Not a bodyguard, not an associate, not one of his so-called friends from endless dinner parties. A janitor. His mind replayed flashes of the night, the rain, the young man's steady hands pressing against his wound, the fierce tone when he'd said "You're not dying on this street tonight." Edward clenched his fists weakly. He should feel gratitude. But instead, he felt exposed, vulnerable. And vulnerability was something he had spent decades burying beneath layers of wealth and power. "No need to contact him," Edward said curtly, waving the nurse away. "It was nothing. Just circumstance." The nurse gave him a look, something between disapproval and pity, but didn't argue. Edward sank back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. Why did he stop? Why him of all people? The question gnawed at him, but pride wrapped itself around his heart like barbed wire. He would not dwell on it. He would recover, return to his empire, and forget the night ever happened. Days passed. Daniel went back to his night shifts, mopping halls and changing light bulbs, trying to push the memory away. But every time his hands touched warm water in a bucket, he remembered blood. Every time he heard someone coughing down a hallway, he remembered Edward's ragged breaths. Yet he told no one. Not his co-workers, not his neighbors. When Lily asked again about the superhero night, he laughed it off, saying, "Daddy just got wet in the rain." Pride kept him silent. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want anyone to know. It was enough that he had done what was right. Still, he wondered. Edward, meanwhile, returned to his penthouse after a week of guarded recovery. The doctors called him fortunate. He dismissed them coldly. The newspapers speculated vaguely about his health scare. He issued a statement downplaying it as exhaustion. But late at night, alone in his glass fortress above the city, he could not escape the memory of Daniel's voice, because nobody deserves to be left like this. It echoed in him, slicing through years of carefully constructed detachment. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in the silence, the weight of gratitude pressing heavy against his pride. He could send money. That would settle it. But the thought repulsed him, reducing a moment of raw humanity to a transaction. And yet, to admit he needed something more than money, acknowledgement, connection, felt unbearable. So he did nothing. For both men, the memory lived on like a stone in their shoes, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore, yet not spoken aloud. Daniel buried himself in survival, convincing himself it didn't matter. Edward buried himself in pride, convincing himself he didn't care. And yet, somewhere deep within, they both knew the story was not finished. Not yet. Why do you think people resist admitting when someone has changed their life? Pride? Fear? Or the belief they don't deserve it? Comment your thoughts below. The morning after the storm carried a strange stillness. The city moved on, as it always did, but Daniel Hayes couldn't. He sat slouched at the small kitchen table of his one-bedroom apartment, his uniform from the night before draped across a chair. The smell of bleach still clung to it, but beneath it was another scent he couldn't escape, the faint, metallic tang of blood. He had scrubbed his hands raw, red lines cutting across his knuckles from the soap, yet when he lifted them into the light, he swore he still saw crimson stains beneath his nails. Steam rose from the chipped mug of coffee in front of him, untouched. He stared at it blankly, the clock ticking on the wall like a drumbeat marking the fact that another shift was only hours away. The sound of tiny feet padding across the linoleum broke the silence. "Daddy." He turned. Lily, his 6-year-old, shuffled into the room, rubbing her eyes. Her unicorn pajamas dragged at the sleeves, her hair a wild golden tangle. She blinked at him, then climbed onto his lap without waiting for permission. Her small head rested against his chest, fitting neatly in the curve of his arm. "You're home late again." Daniel forced his tired voice into warmth. "Yes, sweet pea. Long night." Her small nose wrinkled. "You smell like soap." "That's 'cause your old man spends half his life with a mop," he teased, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. She giggled, but then peered at him curiously. "Something happened, huh?" Daniel's smile faltered. "Kids noticed more than you wanted them to." He hesitated, weighing how much truth she could handle. "I just helped somebody, that's all." Her eyes lit up. Like a superhero? He let out a low laugh, though his chest tightened. Not exactly. Just a guy in the wrong place at the right time. Lily frowned. Superheroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear uniforms that smell like bleach. Her giggle bubbled out again, and Daniel couldn't help but laugh with her. Her joy was a balm, a reminder of why he worked until his bones ached. For her. Always for her. But when she scampered off to grab her toys, his laughter faded into silence. He stared down at his scarred hands again, remembering the frailty of the older man's pulse, the rasp of his breath, the whispered thank you. Who was he? Did he make it? The questions circled his mind, but he shook them away. It wasn't his business anymore. He had bills stacked on the counter, overdue notices taped to the fridge. He had Lily's school lunch to pack, a shift to get to, and a landlord who didn't accept I saved someone's life as rent payment. Whatever happened to that man belonged to another world, one Daniel would never be part of. On the other side of the city, Edward Langford opened his eyes to the sterile brightness of a private hospital suite. Machines beeped steadily around him. His chest ached where bandages wrapped tight across his ribs. For a long moment, he simply stared at the ceiling, disoriented. The last thing he remembered was the rain, the sharp flare of pain, and then eyes. A young man's eyes, steady, determined, refusing to look away. A nurse entered quietly, checking his vitals. "Good morning, Mr. Langford. You're very fortunate. A few more minutes without help, and you wouldn't have made it." Edward's jaw tightened. He despised the word fortunate. It suggested something out of his control, and Edward Langford had built his empire on control. "Who brought me here?" His voice was rough, his throat dry. The nurse glanced at her clipboard. A young man. Said his name was Daniel. He stayed until we took over. Looked like, well, a janitor, if I'm being honest. Edward frowned. A janitor. Of all the people in this city, politicians who courted him, executives who envied him, so-called friends who smiled for his money, not one of them had been there. It had been a janitor. He remembered flashes, the man's jacket pressed to his chest, his fierce voice saying you're not dying on this street tonight. It unsettled him. "Don't bother contacting him," Edward said curtly, waving the nurse away. It was nothing. Just circumstance. The nurse gave him a look, pity mixed with quiet reproach, but nodded. Edward leaned back against the pillows, staring at the sterile white ceiling. Why did he stop? Why him? The question gnawed at him, but pride coiled in his chest. Gratitude felt like weakness, and weakness was something Edward Langford did not allow himself. The week blurred for Daniel. He worked his shifts, dragging the mop across hallways that smelled of lemon disinfectant. He fixed broken light bulbs, scrubbed graffiti from lockers, emptied trash bins that smelled of spoiled lunches. His co-workers joked idly about sports and late paychecks, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. He never told them. How could he? What would they say? That he was a hero? He didn't want that. He didn't believe it. He had simply done what anyone should have. And yet, not everyone had. He remembered the way people turned away at the bus stop. How no one else had even slowed down. That truth weighed heavy on him. At home, Lily asked again about the superhero night. He smiled, ruffled her hair, and said, "Daddy just got wet in the rain." It was easier that way. To bury it. To move on. Still, every time his hands touched warm water in a mop bucket, He remembered blood. Every cough and the echo of a hallway brought back Edward's ragged breathing. No matter how he tried to wash it away, the memory clung. Edward returned to his penthouse after a week of recovery, against the advice of his doctors. The newspapers speculated vaguely about a health scare. He issued a statement dismissing it as exhaustion. At first, he tried to bury himself in work, stock reports, board meetings, endless contracts. But late at night, when the city lights sprawled beneath him like a glittering sea, silence pressed in. He poured whiskey into a crystal glass and sat in the dark, hearing the young man's voice again, because nobody deserves to be left like this. The words cracked something inside him, something he had spent years fortifying. He thought of his estranged children, too proud to call. His wife, retreating into her own world of resentment. His colleagues, circling like vultures around his empire. He had surrounded himself with people, yet in the end, it had been a stranger in a janitor's uniform who had seen him. He could send money. That was the language he understood. But the thought sickened him. To reduce raw compassion to a transaction? To insult it with a check? And yet, what else could he do? To admit he wanted something more, acknowledgement, connection, felt unbearable. So he did nothing. He drank, he worked, he stared out at the city. But the memory lived on, like a splinter he couldn't remove. Both men carried the night with them in silence. Daniel buried himself in survival, convincing himself it didn't matter. Edward buried himself in pride, convincing himself he didn't care. But no matter how hard they resisted, no matter how they denied it, something had shifted. And deep down, in a place neither of them dared admit, they both knew their story together wasn't over. Not yet. Why do you think people find it so hard to admit when someone has saved or changed them? Is it pride, fear, or the belief they don't deserve it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Rain gave way to a crisp spring afternoon, the kind of day that made the city look deceptively kind. Daniel pushed his mop bucket down Jefferson High's main corridor, humming under his breath to distract himself from the dull ache in his shoulders. Life had settled back into its rhythm. Bills still piled up, shifts still dragged on, Lily still greeted him at the door each night with messy hair and wide eyes. He had convinced himself the bus stop night was behind him. A memory, nothing more. But fate doesn't let go so easily. Edward Langford had not stopped thinking about the young janitor. Pride warred with curiosity until curiosity won. He couldn't shake Daniel's voice, or the way those steady hands had held his life without hesitation. He told himself it was business. A man like him needed to understand the kind of people who still acted without self-interest. But the truth, buried under his boardroom bravado, was that Edward wanted to see him again. So he made a phone call. Discreet inquiries led to a name, then an address, then an employer. And one late afternoon, a black sedan pulled up outside Jefferson High School. Daniel was wringing out his mop when Principal Graves appeared in the doorway, her eyebrows raised. "Daniel, you have visitors." "Visitors?" He frowned. Nobody visited him. Before he could ask further, a tall man in a sharp gray suit stepped inside. His presence was commanding, like he carried the weight of wealth in his very posture. Behind him, another man, younger, in an immaculate coat, scanned the hallway with practiced indifference. Daniel straightened, suspicion rising. "Daniel Hayes?" the suited man asked. "Yeah. Mr. Langford would like a word." He gestured toward the entrance. Daniel blinked. "Mr. Who?" The sedan's door opened, and Edward Langford stepped out carefully, his movements still stiff from recovery. He was dressed impeccably, as always, but there was a fragility beneath the polish now. His silver hair gleamed in the late sunlight, his sharp eyes narrowing when they found Daniel. For a long moment, neither spoke. "You," Edward said finally. Daniel's mop handle squeaked as he tightened his grip. "You're alive." Edward's lips twitched. "So it would seem. Thanks to you." Daniel shifted uneasily. "I just did what anyone would've." Edward's gaze hardened. "No. That's where you're wrong. Nobody else did." The silence between them thickened, heavy with things unsaid. Edward took a slow breath. "I came to thank you. In person." Daniel shook his head. "You don't have to." "I do." Edward's voice cut sharp. He gestured to the car. "Come with me." Daniel's eyes widened. "What?" "No, I've got work." "I'll handle it," Principal Graves interjected from the doorway, curiosity gleaming in her eyes. "Go on, Daniel." He stared at her, betrayed. Then at Edward, whose expression brooked no argument. Finally, with a muttered curse under his breath, Daniel followed. The ride in the sedan was suffocating. Daniel sat rigid, his lunchbox on his lap like a shield. Edward sat opposite, studying him with an intensity that made Daniel squirm. "You work nights?" Edward asked, as if testing him. "Yeah. And raise your daughter alone." Daniel's head snapped up. "How do you?" "I asked around." Edward's tone was casual, but Daniel heard the steel underneath. "It wasn't difficult." Daniel clenched his jaw. "With all your money, I'm sure it wasn't." Edward's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "You don't like me." "I don't know you." Daniel's tone was flat. "But I know your type." Edward arched an eyebrow. "My type?" "The kind that thinks they can buy their way out of anything." Silence crackled. For a moment, Edward's eyes flashed with the sting of truth. Then quietly he said, "Perhaps that's why I'm here. Because for once, money didn't matter." Daniel looked away, startled by the honesty. The car pulled up outside Daniel's apartment building, a weathered brick complex with peeling paint and rusted railings. Daniel frowned. "Why here?" Edward leaned forward. "Because if I'm going to thank a man, I intend to see the life he's protecting." Before Daniel could stop him, Edward was out of the car. His driver hovered protectively, but Edward waved him off. Slowly, carefully, the billionaire followed Daniel up the narrow stairwell that smelled of old carpet and fried food. Daniel's apartment was small but warm. Toys littered the floor. Drawings hung on the fridge, most signed in Lily's uneven scrawl. The space radiated love despite its modesty. "Daddy." Lily came barreling out of her room, clutching a stuffed unicorn. She skidded to a halt when she saw Edward, her eyes widening. "Who's that?" Daniel crouched. "Sweet pea, this is a friend." Edward's heart clenched at the word. Friend. When was the last time anyone had called him that? Lily studied him seriously, then smiled. "Hi. I'm Lily. You want to see my drawings?" Edward blinked, thrown off balance. "Drawings?" "Yes. Come on." She grabbed his hand without hesitation, tugging him toward the fridge. Daniel watched, arms crossed, both wary and faintly amused. Edward, the man whose signature could shake stock markets, stood in his kitchen nodding solemnly at stick figures with rainbow hair. "This one's Daddy and me," Lily announced proudly, pointing at a picture with two smiling figures. Edward's throat tightened unexpectedly. "It's beautiful." Lily beamed. "You can take one home if you want." Daniel nearly choked. "Lily, he doesn't." But Edward cut him off softly. "I'd be honored." He accepted the crayon drawing as though it were more valuable than any contract he had ever signed. Later, when Lily had gone back to her toys, Edward turned to Daniel. "You've given her a good home. Despite everything." Daniel bristled. "What do you mean, despite everything?" Edward met his eyes. "I mean you carry burdens most men would collapse under. And you do it quietly." Daniel swallowed, caught off guard. "I don't need your pity." "This isn't pity," Edward said firmly. "It's respect." The word hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. Daniel didn't know what to do with it. As evening fell, Edward stood to leave. Lily hugged him goodbye as if he were family already. He hesitated before stepping out the door, his gaze lingering on the warmth of the little apartment. "Daniel," he said at last, "you may think I came here to settle a debt. But the truth is," he paused, searching for words he had not spoken in years, "you reminded me what it means to be human. And I don't intend to forget it." Daniel stared at him, unsure how to respond. Edward offered a small nod, then turned and walked back to his car. Daniel closed the door slowly, his heart pounding. Forced together by circumstance, they had crossed a line neither could retreat from. Their worlds had collided, and whether they liked it or not, neither man would ever be the same. What do you think Edward truly wants from Daniel? To repay a debt, or to find something he's been missing all his life? Comment your thoughts below. The next time Edward Langford appeared in Daniel's world, it wasn't in a polished sedan or with suited assistants. It was in the quiet hum of Jefferson High's boiler room, where Daniel was repairing a stubborn leak that had left a puddle spreading across the tiles. Edward's voice echoed, deep and deliberate. "You work harder than most men with 10 times your salary." Daniel jerked upright, nearly hitting his head on the pipe. "What the hell are you doing down here?" Edward stepped inside, his expensive shoes out of place against the grimy floor. "Observing." Daniel snorted. "Rich men don't observe boiler rooms. What do you want?" Edward hesitated, his expression unreadable. Then he lowered himself, awkwardly stiff from his injuries, onto a nearby bench. "The truth." Daniel froze. "About what?" "About you." For a moment, the only sound was the drip of water. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You think I'm a project," he muttered. "Some charity case you can study?" Edward's gaze didn't waver. "I think you're a man who risked his life for a stranger without hesitation. And men like that don't just appear out of nowhere. There's a story behind you. I want to know it." Daniel shook his head. "You don't. Trust me." Edward leaned forward slightly. "Try me." The past was a locked box Daniel rarely opened, but Edward's persistence chipped at it. His fingers tightened on the wrench until his knuckles whitened. Finally, he let out a harsh breath. "My wife left when Lily was 3. Said she couldn't handle it anymore. The hours, the bills, the grind. I wasn't enough. Or maybe I was too much. Either way, she walked out and never looked back." The words came out flat, but his throat burned. "I begged her to stay. For Lily's sake. But she didn't want the weight of a broken man tied to a mop bucket. So it's just been me. Scrubbing floors, patching leaks, whatever it takes to keep a roof over Lily's head. Edward studied him, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. And you never heard from her again? Daniel shook his head. Not once. She disappeared into some new life, clean slate, like we never existed. Silence stretched. Daniel forced a bitter laugh. So yeah, that's me. A janitor with a kid and a laundry list of failures. Not much of a story for a man like you. But when he glanced up, Edward's expression wasn't pity. It was recognition. Edward leaned back slowly, his hands clasped. For the first time since they'd met, his voice lost its edge. My father was a steel worker. Died when I was 19. Left us with nothing but debts and a broken family name. I swore I'd never be powerless again. That I'd build something untouchable. His gaze drifted toward the grimy floor, as if he could see through time. And I did. I built an empire. But in the process, I destroyed my marriage. I lost my children. Money bought me walls so high that even the people I loved couldn't climb them. Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his tone. Edward's voice roughened. My son hasn't spoken to me in 5 years. My daughter sends Christmas cards without signatures. And my wife, he exhaled shakily. She looks at me like I'm a stranger. All because I chose power over presence. He paused, swallowing hard. So when you say you're a failure, Daniel, I see the opposite. You stayed. That makes you stronger than you know. The room felt smaller, as if the weight of both their confessions had pulled the walls closer. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. Funny, isn't it? You wanted to escape being powerless, and I've been powerless all along. Guess we're just two sides of the same busted coin. Edward's lips twitched in a humorless smile. Perhaps. But maybe that's why fate threw us together. Daniel shook his head. I don't believe in fate. Edward's gaze softened, almost weary. Neither did I. Until a janitor refused to let me die on a street corner. That night, Edward didn't return immediately to his glass-walled penthouse. Instead, he lingered. Daniel, against his better judgment, let him walk home with him. Lily was already in pajamas, sitting cross-legged on the floor with crayons scattered around her. She looked up eagerly. Mr. Edward. Edward's brows rose. Mr. Edward. Daniel groaned. Lily. But she was already running to him, proudly holding up a new drawing. It's you and Daddy. Edward blinked. On the paper, 2 stick figures stood side by side, one tall with gray hair, the other with a mop in hand. Above them, a crooked rainbow stretched across the sky. For the second time, Edward felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. He crouched slowly, his injured ribs protesting, and accepted the paper as if it were priceless. Thank you, he whispered. Lily grinned. You can keep it forever. Later, after Lily had gone to bed, Daniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed. She doesn't understand. She just thinks you're nice. Edward met his eyes steadily. And you don't. Daniel hesitated, then looked away. I don't know what you are. Edward let the silence linger. Then he said softly, a man trying to remember how to be better. The words sank deep. Daniel didn't answer, but something inside him shifted. Over the next week, Edward returned more than once. Sometimes he brought groceries, though Daniel protested every time. Other nights, He simply sat at the kitchen table while Lily chattered endlessly about school. The more Edward came, the more Daniel glimpsed the cracks in his polished armor. He caught the billionaire staring too long at Lily's drawings, his eyes clouding as if remembering something lost. He noticed the way Edward's hands trembled when he held a simple mug of coffee, as though unused to such ordinary rituals. And one evening, when Lily fell asleep on the couch mid-story, Edward quietly draped a blanket over her shoulders. His face softened in a way Daniel had never seen. "Do you miss them?" Daniel asked before he could stop himself. Edward's jaw clenched. "Every day." Daniel studied him for a long moment. "Then why don't you call?" Edward's eyes flicked to him, sharp and defensive. But behind the steel was something else. Fear. "Because I don't know if they'd answer." The honesty in his voice made Daniel's chest ache. For both men, the past had always been a wound kept hidden. But in the cramped warmth of Daniel's apartment, those wounds bled into the open. And though painful, there was a strange relief in it. Daniel, who had been abandoned. Edward, who had done the abandoning. Two broken stories, laid bare side by side. And in that fragile, uncomfortable honesty, something began to take root. Not friendship, not yet. But something neither could name. Do you think people are more haunted by the pain of being abandoned, or by the regret of abandoning someone else? Which weighs heavier on the heart? Share your thoughts in the comments. The next Saturday morning dawned soft and golden, sunlight spilling across the cracked blinds of Daniel's apartment. He awoke to the smell of pancakes, which puzzled him, because he hadn't started cooking yet. He rubbed his eyes, shuffled out of the bedroom, and froze. There, in his small kitchen, stood Edward Langford. The billionaire's blazer was draped neatly over a chair, his crisp shirt sleeves rolled up, and in his hand was a spatula. He looked wildly out of place against Daniel's chipped countertops and mismatched pans. And yet he was flipping pancakes with painstaking precision while Lily perched on a stool beside him, offering enthusiastic commentary. "Flip it higher this time, Mr. Edward," she squealed. Edward gave her a sideways glance, deadpan. "If I flip it any higher, it will stick to the ceiling, and then your father will never forgive me." Lily giggled so hard she nearly toppled from her stool. Daniel leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, torn between irritation and amusement. "What are you doing?" Edward looked up calmly. "Breakfast." Daniel blinked. "In my kitchen?" "Yes." Edward slid a pancake onto a plate with surgical precision. "Your daughter insisted." Lily chimed in, beaming. "I told him you always burn the edges, Daddy. But look, he made them perfect." Daniel shot her a mock glare. "Traitor." She giggled again and stuffed a bite into her mouth. Edward raised an eyebrow. "She's brutally honest. She must get that from you." Daniel snorted, reluctantly moving to pour himself coffee. "You're not exactly subtle yourself." They sat around the small kitchen table, Daniel in his worn chair, Lily swinging her legs, and Edward sitting stiffly, as though unused to the intimacy of such a space. But as Lily chattered on about her school play, Daniel noticed something strange. Edward was listening. Not with the distracted politeness of a busy man, but with full, undivided attention. His eyes softened at her excitement, his lips twitching into a faint smile whenever she described some misadventure. And Daniel, against his better judgment, felt something ease inside him. Later that day, Edward insisted on accompanying them to the park. Daniel argued, but Lily's squeals of "Come on, Daddy, please," ended the debate. The park was alive with spring, the smell of fresh-cut grass, the laughter of children, the rhythmic creak of swings swaying back and forth. Daniel pushed Lily on the swings while Edward stood nearby, hands clasped behind his back, as though guarding something precious. "Higher, Daddy!" Lily cried. Daniel laughed. "If you fly off, I'm not explaining that to the ER." She squealed with delight as he pushed again. Edward watched, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke quietly. "She trusts you completely." Daniel glanced at him. "She's my whole world. She doesn't have anyone else." Edward's jaw tightened. "You underestimate how extraordinary that is. Most men can't carry that kind of devotion." Daniel looked away, unsettled by the sincerity in his tone. When Lily dashed off to play with other children, the two men sat on a nearby bench. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Edward said, almost reluctantly, "I used to take my children to a park like this. Years ago." Daniel waited. Edward's gaze was fixed on the playground, but his eyes seemed to see something far away. "My son loved the swings. My daughter liked the slide. I was always checking my watch, taking calls. I told myself I was building their future, but all they wanted was me." His voice caught, rough at the edges. "And I wasn't there." Daniel's chest tightened. Edward turned to him suddenly, his eyes sharp. "Don't ever think you're less than because you push a mop instead of signing contracts. Your daughter will never care about your job title. She will only care that you showed up." Daniel swallowed hard, the words cutting deeper than he expected. He muttered, "Funny. You sound like you believe that." Edward looked away. "I believe it now. Too late." The silence that followed was thick with both pain and understanding. That evening, back at the apartment, Lily begged Edward to read her a bedtime story. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but Daniel gave a small shrug. So Edward sat on the edge of Lily's bed, holding a worn picture book with awkward hands. His voice was stiff at first, formal, as if he were reading minutes from a board meeting. But Lily corrected him. No, you have to do the funny voices." Edward blinked. "Funny voices?" "Yes," she insisted. "Daddy makes the dragon sound like he has a cold. You try." Daniel smirked from the doorway, arms crossed. "Go on. Let's hear it." Edward shot him a glare, then cleared his throat. When he spoke again, his deep, commanding voice wobbled into something gravelly and absurd. "I am a very sneezy dragon." Lily burst into uncontrollable giggles. Even Daniel couldn't contain his laughter. Edward looked at both of them, surprised by the warmth spreading through him, and for the first time in years, he laughed too. Not the polite chuckle he used in boardrooms, but a real, unguarded laugh. As days turned into weeks, their bond grew in small, quiet ways. Edward learned how Daniel took his coffee, strong, no sugar. Daniel learned Edward had a weakness for Lily's silly knock-knock jokes. Lily learned she could braid Edward's silver hair while he pretended not to mind. The billionaire who once stood untouchable in glass towers now found himself sitting cross-legged on the floor of a cramped apartment, sipping lukewarm cocoa while coloring with crayons. And he didn't hate it. In fact, he began to crave it. One evening, after Lily had fallen asleep on the couch, Daniel and Edward sat together in the dim glow of the TV, which played quietly in the background. Daniel broke the silence first. "You know this can't last forever, right?" Edward glanced at him. "What can't?" "This." Daniel gestured vaguely around the room. You. Here. Us, pretending like we're not from completely different worlds. Edward's jaw tightened. Why not? Daniel let out a bitter laugh. Because sooner or later, you'll remember who you are. Billionaire. Boardrooms. Private jets. And I'll still be the guy scrubbing toilets. Edward's voice lowered. Don't reduce yourself to that. You're more than the sum of your paychecks. Daniel shook his head. You don't get it. People like you don't stick around people like me. Edward hesitated, then said quietly, maybe I don't want to be people like me anymore. The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Daniel's heart thudded, but he didn't reply. In the weeks that followed, their fragile bond deepened. They shared late-night talks over cheap takeout. They laughed at Lily's antics until their sides ached. They found solace in silences that no longer felt awkward but safe. For Daniel, it was the first time in years he felt seen as more than a janitor. For Edward, it was the first time in years he felt like a man rather than an empire. It was healing. It was fragile. It was real. And deep down, both knew it couldn't stay untouched forever. Do you believe love and connection can truly bridge the gap between two completely different worlds? Or does reality always catch up? Share your perspective in the comments. The first cracks appeared quietly. Edward had been spending more and more time at Daniel's apartment, slipping away from his corporate obligations with flimsy excuses. For weeks, he had convinced himself it was manageable. The board could wait, the markets could wait. What mattered was here, in this cramped home filled with warmth. But Edward Langford was not a man who could go unnoticed. It began with whispers in the business columns. Langford seen stepping out of modest neighborhood. Langford neglecting board meetings. Investors raise concerns about his absence. Then came the calls. Dozens of them, buzzing his phone while he sat at Daniel's table sipping burnt coffee. He ignored them. But silence has a cost. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday night. Daniel had just returned from work, his uniform still damp from a leaky mop bucket, when he found Edward sitting stiffly on the couch, his phone in his hand, his jaw tight. Daniel frowned. What's wrong? Edward didn't look up. The board staged an emergency meeting. They're threatening to move against me if I don't return to the helm immediately. Daniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed. So go. Edward's eyes flicked up sharply. Is that what you want? What I want. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. Edward, this isn't complicated. You're a billionaire. I'm a janitor. We don't live in the same universe. Of course you should go. Edward stood abruptly, anger sparking in his voice. Don't reduce what we've shared to some cliché about money. That's not what this is. Daniel's chest tightened. Then what is it? Because right now it feels like a temporary distraction before you go back to your towers and I go back to scrubbing floors. Edward's eyes flashed, wounded. Is that truly what you think of me? Daniel's voice cracked, raw. I don't know what to think of you. You show up here in my world, like you actually care, but sooner or later, you'll remember who you are. And I'll be left explaining to my daughter why her so-called friend disappeared. The words landed like knives. Edward's hands clenched into fists. Do you think I came here out of pity? That I spend hours in this apartment, listening to your daughter's stories, laughing over your miserable takeout, because I feel sorry for you? Daniel glared at him, his voice low and shaking. Tell me it isn't pity then. Tell me it isn't guilt for all the people you ignored in your life. Tell me I'm not just redemption to you." The room fell silent. Edward opened his mouth, and then shut it. His silence said more than words ever could. Lily padded into the room, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy? Why are you yelling?" Daniel swallowed hard, his chest burning. He forced a smile for her. "Go back to bed, sweet pea. Everything's fine." She looked uncertain, her gaze flicking between the two men, but she obeyed. When she was gone, Daniel turned back to Edward, his voice quieter now but no less cutting. "I can't let her get attached to you if you're just going to walk away. I won't let her go through that again." Edward's face twisted, the mask of composure cracking. "You think I want to walk away? That I enjoy tearing myself in two between the man I was and the man I want to be?" Daniel's voice broke. "Then choose. Right here. Right now." Edward froze. The silence stretched. The ticking of the old wall clock filled the space like a countdown. And then slowly, Edward shook his head. "I can't." The words shattered Daniel more than a shout ever could. His chest heaved, tears burning his eyes, though he refused to let them fall. He pointed to the door. "Then go." Edward flinched. "Daniel." "Go." The door closed with a soft click, but the sound echoed in Daniel's chest like a slammed vault. He sank into the couch, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders trembling. The apartment felt emptier than it ever had, despite Lily's soft breathing in the next room. He had known, hadn't he? Deep down, he had always known. But knowing didn't make the loss hurt less. Across the city, Edward sat in the back of his black sedan, the streetlights streaking past like blurred ghosts. His driver said nothing. Edward's hand still held Lily's crayon drawing, crumpled slightly from how tightly he had been gripping it. He stared at it until his vision blurred, his throat constricting with something he hadn't felt in years. Regret. But regret didn't undo choices. Regret didn't erase silence. He had been given a chance to choose differently, and he had failed. Just like before. The days that followed were heavy. Daniel went to work, dragging his mop through endless hallways, but his body felt leaden, his spirit hollow. Co-workers noticed the change but said nothing. At home, Lily asked where Mr. Edward was. Daniel forced a smile, lying through his teeth. "He's busy, sweet pea." But at night, when she was asleep, he sat in the dark kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, staring at the door as though half expecting it to open. It never did. Edward threw himself back into his empire. Meetings stretched into late nights. Stock prices surged as he returned to command. The newspapers hailed him as a titan restored. But the applause felt hollow. He sat in boardrooms surrounded by men who bowed to his wealth, yet he had never felt more alone. He returned to his penthouse, its walls lined with art worth millions, and found it unbearable in its emptiness. Everywhere he turned he saw ghosts, Daniel's steady eyes, Lily's giggle, the warmth of a kitchen filled with burnt pancakes and crayons. But he had made his choice. And choices have consequences. Both men, in their separate worlds, carried the same ache. Daniel, anger tangled with heartbreak, telling himself he had been a fool to believe. Edward, pride tangled with regret, telling himself he had been a coward to leave. The fragile bridge they had built had collapsed, leaving them stranded on opposite sides. And in the wreckage, each asked themselves the same question: were we ever truly meant to find each other? When someone fails to choose you, do you think it's better to walk away forever, or give them a chance to come back? What would you do? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The first week without Edward was suffocating. Daniel filled his hours with routine, cleaning classrooms, patching broken lockers, folding laundry, making Lily's lunch. Every task was performed with mechanical precision, as though if he kept moving, he wouldn't have to notice the ache that had rooted itself in his chest. But silence is louder when you're trying to outrun it. Every corner of his apartment whispered memories. The kitchen table where Edward had eaten pancakes with Lily, the living room where he had made a fool of himself with sneezy dragon voices, the worn couch where he and Daniel had shared their first real conversation about regrets. Daniel cursed himself for letting Edward in. He should have known better. The world was built on divides. Men like Edward never stayed with men like him. Yet every time Lily asked, "When's Mr. Edward coming back?" his heart cracked a little deeper. He told her Edward was busy, that he had important work to do, that he might not come for a while. But when her face fell in disappointment, Daniel had to turn away, because the truth was far crueler. He didn't know if Edward would come back at all. Across the city, Edward sat in his penthouse office, staring at a skyline that gleamed with wealth yet felt hollow. His desk was buried in contracts, financial reports, proposals that once thrilled him. Now, he shuffled them aimlessly, his mind elsewhere. He thought of Daniel's words, "Tell me it isn't pity. Tell me it isn't guilt." He had stayed silent. Silence had always been his armor, the way he kept control. But this time, silence had cost him something irretrievable. He had walked out of that apartment carrying more than just regret. He had carried the weight of every mistake he'd ever made with his own children. He told himself he had no right to intrude on Daniel's life again. That the man had been clear, go. But at night, when the city outside buzzed with artificial life, Edward sat alone in his vast penthouse, staring at the childish drawing Lily had given him. A stick-figure family, 3 smiling faces under a crooked sun. For the first time in years, he admitted the truth to himself. He wanted to be part of that picture. But want and deserve were 2 different things. Daniel's nights grew heavier. Sleep eluded him. When he did drift off, he dreamed of Edward, sometimes standing at the door, sometimes sitting silently across from him at the table, sometimes walking away into a blur of city lights. He woke each time with the same hollow ache. He told himself to move on. He told himself to protect Lily. He told himself he was better off without a man who couldn't choose them. But one evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a beer in his hand and whispered aloud, "Why wasn't I enough?" The words startled him, because he hadn't meant to say them. But once spoken, they hung in the air, undeniable. It wasn't just about Edward. It was about every dismissal he had endured, every door closed in his face, every time someone looked through him because of the uniform he wore. And beneath it all was a longing he could no longer ignore, the longing to be chosen. Edward, meanwhile, began to avoid mirrors. Every time he caught his reflection, he didn't see the powerful businessman the world revered. He saw the man Daniel had confronted, a man too cowardly to answer a plea with truth. In the stillness of night, Edward revisited every moment, the laughter in the park, the warmth of Lily's small hand gripping his, the quiet strength in Daniel's eyes when he spoke of showing up for his daughter. Those moments had cracked something open in him, something he had long buried under boardrooms and wealth. He realized he had been wrong all along. Success wasn't measured by towers of glass or stocks soaring on Wall Street. Success was pancakes on a chipped plate, crayons scattered on a floor, a little girl who trusted him enough to fall asleep at his side. And he had walked away. But perhaps, it wasn't too late to turn back. Daniel wrestled with his pride. There were nights he almost picked up his phone, almost typed Edward's number, only to slam it back down, telling himself he made his choice. Don't beg for scraps. But then Lily would mention Edward in some small way. Remember when Mr. Edward made the dragon voice? Or do you think he'd like my drawing for school? And Daniel's resolve wavered. What if he reached out, not for himself, but for her? And yet the fear of rejection stopped him cold. He couldn't risk hearing Edward say no, not when his heart had barely survived the first fracture. Edward, too, hovered on the edge of decision. His assistant brought him contracts that required signatures, meetings that demanded presence. But he found himself staring out of windows, wondering if Daniel had already moved on, if Lily had already forgotten him. The thought hollowed him out. He thought of writing a letter, of sending gifts, of making some grand gesture. But Daniel wasn't a man who wanted charity. He didn't want trinkets bought with guilt. He wanted presence, truth, choice. The very things Edward had denied him. 2 men. 2 silences. Each night, Daniel stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over Edward's contact. Each night, Edward stared at his own reflection, rehearsing the words he might say if given one more chance. But neither moved. Until the night everything shifted. It was late on a Friday when Lily climbed onto Daniel's lap, her small face serious. "Daddy," she whispered, "is Mr. Edward mad at us?" Daniel froze. "No, sweet pea. He's not mad." "Then why doesn't he come back?" The innocence in her voice pierced through him. He opened his mouth to lie again, but the truth caught in his throat. Tears stung his eyes as he held her closer. "I don't know, baby. I really don't know." She pressed her cheek against his chest, whispering, "I miss him." And in that moment, Daniel realized something that shook him. Whatever pain he felt, Lily felt too. And if he stayed silent, if he let pride rule him, he wasn't protecting her. He was teaching her to accept abandonment as normal. He couldn't let that happen. For her sake, he had to risk the answer, even if it shattered him. That same night, Edward sat in his penthouse, a glass of untouched whiskey at his elbow. The city glittered outside, but his gaze was fixed on the childish drawing taped to the wall. For weeks he had told himself Daniel would never forgive him, that showing up again would only wound them both. But the longer he stared at that drawing, the more he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would rather face Daniel's fury than live another day with this silence. For the first time in years, Edward Langford felt fear, not of markets or power struggles, but of losing the only family that had made him feel human again. And with that fear came decision. In 2 separate rooms, under the same night sky, 2 men made their choices. Daniel picked up his phone, his hand trembling, and scrolled to Edward's name. He hesitated, took a deep breath, and pressed call. At the same moment, Edward rose from his chair, grabbed his coat, and strode toward the door, determination burning in his chest. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Daniel's heart pounded. Was he a fool? On the 4th ring, a voice answered, breathless, hurried. "Daniel." It was Edward. And for the first time in weeks, Daniel allowed himself to breathe. Do you think pride should ever stop someone from reaching out? Or is love worth risking rejection every single time? Share your thoughts in the comments. The silence after Edward's breathless Daniel stretched like a bridge between 2 worlds. Daniel's throat was tight. He almost hung up, fear clawing at him. But then Lily stirred in the other room, murmuring in her sleep, and he forced himself to stay. "It's me, Daniel said finally, his voice rough. Edward exhaled audibly, relief flooding through the line. I thought I'd lost you. Daniel's chest ached at the words. Maybe you have. There was a pause, weighted and raw. Then Edward's voice came, low but urgent. Where are you? In the same place I've always been, Daniel replied bitterly. The same apartment. The same world you walked away from. I'm coming, Edward said. And before Daniel could respond, the line went dead. 20 minutes later, a knock rattled the apartment door. Daniel stood frozen, staring at it. His hand hovered over the knob, trembling. When he finally opened it, Edward was there. No chauffeur, no polished entourage. Just a man in a rain-soaked coat, his silver hair damp, his face etched with exhaustion and something deeper, desperation. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Lily appeared behind Daniel, rubbing her eyes. Mr. Edward, she whispered. Edward's eyes softened instantly. He crouched down, his voice cracking. Hello, little one. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. He hugged her fiercely, as though afraid she might vanish if he let go. Daniel's chest burned watching them. When Edward finally rose, his gaze locked with Daniel's. We need to talk. Daniel stepped aside reluctantly. Come in. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Edward stood awkwardly in the living room while Daniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his defenses up. Lily had gone back to bed, leaving the air heavy between them. Edward broke the silence first. I owe you the truth. No excuses this time. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Truth about what? That you're a billionaire who belongs in glass towers, not here? That I was stupid to believe we could. Stop, Edward interrupted sharply, then lowered his voice. Stop tearing yourself down before I even speak. That's not who you are to me. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then who am I? Edward stepped closer, his eyes fierce. The man who saw me bleeding on a street when the entire city walked past. The man who didn't care about my money or my name, only whether I lived. The man whose daughter reminded me of everything I lost, and everything I could still be. That's who you are. Daniel swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. Then why did you leave? Edward's voice cracked. Because I was a coward. Because I've spent my life choosing power over people, and when you asked me to choose differently, I froze. I told myself I couldn't. But the truth is, I wouldn't. And I hate myself for it. The words hung heavy. Daniel shook his head, blinking back tears. You think words fix this? You think an apology erases the look on my daughter's face every time she asked why you didn't come back? Edward flinched as if struck. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I came back because walking away from you, from both of you, was the biggest mistake of my life. And if there's even the smallest chance you'll let me prove it, I'll spend the rest of my days trying. The room was silent except for Daniel's ragged breathing. Part of him wanted to scream, to shove Edward back out the door, to protect himself and Lily from more heartbreak. But another part, the part that remembered Edward laughing at Lily's jokes, reading bedtime stories in silly voices, sitting with him in quiet solidarity, whispered that this was real. Finally, Daniel asked the question that had haunted him since the night Edward left. Why us? Out of all the people in your world, why us? Edward's eyes glistened. Because with you, I'm not Edward Langford, billionaire. I'm just a man. Flawed, broken, trying to be better. And with Lily, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever, the chance to be family again. Daniel's breath caught. Edward stepped closer, his voice trembling. Daniel, I don't want towers or boardrooms. I want burnt pancakes in a small kitchen. I want bedtime stories and knock-knock jokes. I want you. If you'll have me. Daniel's defenses cracked. Tears slipped down his cheeks before he could stop them. You're an idiot, he whispered hoarsely. Edward's lips curved into the faintest, most fragile smile. I know. And then Daniel closed the distance, grabbing Edward's coat and pulling him into a kiss that was rough, messy, and years overdue. Edward responded with equal desperation, his hands trembling as he held Daniel like a lifeline. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was real. The weeks that followed were a slow rebuilding. Edward didn't disappear this time. He showed up, at school pickups, at grocery runs, at nights when Lily begged for just one more story. He stumbled, awkward at times, unused to the rhythm of their small, humble world. But he tried. And that effort mattered more than anything. Daniel, wary at first, began to trust again, not because Edward made grand gestures, but because he stayed. For Edward, the transformation was profound. Boardrooms no longer defined him, laughter in a modest apartment did. For the first time, he started to delegate responsibilities, stepping back from the empire he had once clung to with white-knuckled pride. He realized he hadn't just found love, he had found life. One evening, months later, the three of them stood at the same bus stop where it had all begun. The city roared around them, indifferent as always. But this time, they weren't alone. Edward looked at Daniel, then down at Lily, who was holding both their hands, swinging them back and forth. You know, Edward said softly, this place changed everything for me. Daniel smirked. Bleeding out on a curb isn't exactly the kind of change most people hope for. Edward chuckled, shaking his head. No. But it brought me here. To you. To her. And for that, I'll never stop being grateful. Lily tilted her head curiously. Grateful for what? Edward crouched, meeting her eyes. For your dad. He saved me that night. Not just my life, but everything that makes life worth living. Lily's smile lit up the night. She squeezed both their hands. Then we saved each other. Edward's throat tightened. Yes, sweetheart. We did. Daniel looked at him, his eyes softer than Edward had ever seen. Guess destiny has a funny way of working out. Edward reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. No, he said firmly. Destiny only gave me a second chance. You are the one who made it real. And in that moment, under the hum of city lights and the echo of the night that had started it all, their broken pieces finally fit together. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to build something lasting. Enough to believe in love, at last. Do you believe in destiny moments, those small, unexpected choices that change everything? Was it fate that Daniel and Edward found each other, or just the courage to hold on? Share your thoughts below.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you would surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.